the moment the call came in, everything changed. Not just for Hollywood, not just for music, but for millions of people around the world who grew up watching one man become larger than life. Because on that morning, the most famous entertainer on earth was suddenly fighting for his life behind closed doors, and nobody fully understood what had actually happened. At first, people thought it was simple, a medical emergency, a tragic loss, a heart problem. But within hours, small details started turning this story into something much darker.
A man who should have died.
Something confusing. Something that investigators themselves admitted did not make sense. And over time, the case surrounding Michael Jackson's final hours became one of the most talked about celebrity investigations in modern history. Because the deeper authorities looked, the stranger everything became. The missing details, the hidden medications, the timelines that did not match, the doctor at the center of it all. And one haunting question continued following this case everywhere. Could this tragedy have been prevented? At the time of his passing, Michael Jackson was preparing for what many believed would become the greatest comeback in entertainment history. This Is It, a concert series that was supposed to remind the world why he was once called the king of pop. The pressure surrounding those shows was enormous. Fans were excited, the media was obsessed, and financially, there was a lot riding on it. But behind the scenes, Michael reportedly struggled with something very few people fully understood: sleep. According to investigators and testimonies later revealed in court, sleep had become one of the biggest battles in his life. And that battle would eventually lead investigators toward a powerful medical drug that completely changed the direction of the case. But before anyone even knew that, there was chaos, panic, confusion. Emergency responders arrived expecting a normal rescue call. Instead, they walked into one of the most surreal moments of their careers. One investigator later described the room as unusual almost immediately. Medical equipment, medication, a strange atmosphere, and in the center of it all, Michael Jackson, unresponsive. The people responding that day reportedly did not even realize at first who they were treating until someone looked closer and whispered his name, Michael Jackson. Even years later, many of the investigators involved still remembered that moment vividly, because suddenly this was no longer just another emergency call. The entire world was about to start watching, and according to multiple investigators, one thing bothered them almost immediately: the timeline. They questioned whether help had been called quickly enough. That detail became extremely important later, because when authorities started reconstructing the final hours, they began noticing gaps, and those gaps slowly led attention toward Michael's personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray. At first, investigators were not treating the situation as a criminal case. That's important to understand. In the beginning, many believed this would simply end as a tragic medical incident. But then investigators later learned something shocking. This was not ordinary sleep medication. This was a powerful anesthetic normally associated with highly controlled medical environments. And according to testimonies later revealed, it had reportedly been used repeatedly to help Michael sleep. That revelation stunned investigators, because suddenly this was no longer a simple story about exhaustion. It became a story about medical decisions, risk, responsibility, and desperation. As the investigation intensified, the details became more unsettling. Authorities reportedly discovered medications scattered around the room, IV equipment, medical supplies, and eventually, questions started growing around actions taken during the emergency itself. Investigators later claimed that important evidence appeared to have been cleaned up before help arrived. And that detail became one of the most controversial parts of the entire case, because critics began asking a disturbing question. Why would someone focus on removing medical items during a life-threatening emergency? That question followed the investigation for years, but what made the story even more emotional was Michael himself. Behind the fame, behind the spotlight, behind the legendary performances, investigators described someone physically exhausted, fragile, unable to sleep properly, constantly under pressure, and preparing for one of the biggest performances of his career. Many people forget something important. Michael Jackson was not just a celebrity. He was a global symbol, an icon people connected their childhood memories to, which is why his passing created emotional shockwaves unlike almost anything Hollywood had seen before. Outside the hospital, crowds gathered rapidly. Media vans flooded the streets. Fans cried openly, and the entire world waited for answers. But the answers did not come quickly. In fact, the deeper authorities looked, the more complicated everything became. Investigators began examining phone records, medical records, financial records, witness statements, and eventually, they focused heavily on Dr. Conrad Murray's own explanation of what happened. According to his statements, Michael had been struggling to sleep for hours. Different medications allegedly failed to help, and eventually, propofol entered the conversation. What happened next became the center of one of the most debated celebrity court cases in years, because prosecutors argued that Michael had been placed in an incredibly dangerous situation without proper safeguards. Experts later testified about how serious propofol administration actually is. This was not something casual, not something meant for ordinary bedroom use, not something normally associated with home sleep treatment. And as toxicology reports came back, the investigation took another major turn. Authorities officially ruled Michael Jackson's death a homicide. That announcement shocked the world. Suddenly, this was no longer simply about tragedy. Now it became about accountability. Investigators later claimed that the physical evidence did not match parts of the doctor's explanation. And one detail became especially important: the timing. Phone records reportedly suggested activity during critical moments before emergency services were called. That timeline became devastating during court proceedings, because prosecutors argued that valuable time may have been lost, and when the public heard those details, anger exploded. Many fans believed Michael had failed to receive proper care during the most critical minutes of his life. Others believed the entire entertainment system surrounding him had pushed him beyond exhaustion. The emotional debate became massive. Who was responsible? Was this reckless medical behavior? Was Michael himself too dependent on dangerous sleep treatments? Or was this the result of overwhelming pressure surrounding fame and expectations? That moral conflict became one of the reasons this case stayed alive in public memory for so many years. Because people were not just reacting to facts, they were reacting emotionally. The idea that someone so famous, so admired, could still be deeply vulnerable behind closed doors. That idea haunted people, and perhaps one of the most disturbing elements of the investigation was how isolated Michael reportedly appeared during those final months. Investigators described signs of exhaustion, dependency, emotional pressure, and a desperate search for rest. At one point, authorities reportedly uncovered massive amounts of propofol connected to the investigation. That discovery intensified public outrage even further, because suddenly the scale of the situation became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the trial turned into a media storm. Every testimony became headline news. Every courtroom appearance triggered global attention, and every new detail reignited emotional reactions from fans around the world. Some believed justice was coming. Others believed the charges were too weak. Even investigators themselves reportedly felt frustration over certain legal decisions connected to the case. But eventually, the verdict arrived. Dr. Conrad Murray was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. For many people, the ruling brought closure. For others, it still felt incomplete. Even today, people continue debating the deeper questions surrounding Michael Jackson's final years. How much pressure was he truly under? How exhausted had he become? Could this tragedy have been prevented much earlier? And perhaps the saddest part of all is realizing that behind the legendary image, behind the performances, behind the fame, was still a human being struggling in private. That reality changes how many people now look back at Michael Jackson's story. Because over time, the conversation stopped being only about celebrity. It became about isolation, pressure, fame, and what happens when someone becomes so globally iconic that the world stops seeing the person underneath. And honestly, that may be why this story continues affecting people even decades later. Not because it involved a superstar, but because it revealed how fragile even the biggest stars can become behind closed doors. The final hours of Michael Jackson's life remain one of the most haunting celebrity cases in entertainment history. A story filled with pressure, mystery, mistakes, and emotional questions that still follow Hollywood to this day. And maybe the most unsettling part is that investigators themselves admitted something that continues staying with people years later. This isn't a man who should have died. And yet, he did. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Hollywood's most emotional investigations, make sure to subscribe to Roundtable Celebrity for more cinematic celebrity stories, hidden Hollywood truths, and emotional deep dives into the moments that changed entertainment forever. And tell me in the comments, do you think Michael Jackson's tragedy could have been prevented? Or was this disaster inevitable long before that final night? I'll be reading your thoughts below.